This is the story of a dream wish, to fish like a champion. Gordon Andrews of Foley, Alabama is like you and me, a good fisherman with strong desires, even dreams to become an even better fisherman. We want to learn all those underwater tricks, the tactics, have the knowledge to be as good as the champions who win the major tournaments. Our desire is so strong to improve, to learn, to end the frustration in this underwater contest, to spend just a day with a pro. Why, we'd even make a deal with the devil.
I've been fishing all my life, and I've saved my money and bought a boat that I'm really proud of. I've got the right rods and reels and lures to do the job. But there's just something missing. If I could just fish with somebody like Ricky Clunn, that's a real professional, a guy that knows the details, it would just be the best day of my life.
Hey, what are you waiting on? Let's go fishing.
Is this really happening? Rick Clunn? Biggest name in bass fishing? Why, he's the best of the pros. And we're going to get to fish with him to learn his approach.
Let's start, by eliminating these trees and this old brush that's out in the water here. So why don't you, make a few casts around there with your lure, and I'll try something else.
Well, what do you think I ought to start with, Rick?
Well, what we're trying to do is match the proper lure or tool to the water. And so try to work that bait, close to the water. That bait's going to actually try to draw the fish out through what we call sound. It makes a disturbance on the top. The fish will come out of the bush and chase it, hopefully. If that doesn't work, then what we'll try to do is work our way down to the zone that fish may be at. If he's not aggressive enough to come up to the bait, then we got to go down to him. So we'll probably start working mid-range depths, and then if it have to, we can go all the way down to the bottom to try to catch them.
Sounds great.
So let's start with surface-type baits and try to get them to come out of the brush first. Take a shot at that bush over there. That looks like a likely spot for one to be. All right. Try to cast past the bush. Usually if you hit right on the target, then it looks good, but more often than not, you're going to spook the fish away. So always try to cast past your target and then bring your bait back through the strike zone. Okay. Even try to throw all the way to the bank, so you still hit fairly close to the bush. If he's real aggressive, he'll still come out there and hit it, but if he's not, he's going to run away from there because it's going to spook him. By the time he comes back to the bush to see what's going on, your lure's going to be back at the boat. So try to throw all the way to the bank. There you go.
Ooh, God, what a fish.
Come on, come on.
Come on, baby. He's gonna get me. Oh, look at that fish. Look at that fish. Woo. What a, oh, God. Come here, Mama. Oh, no, don't get up.
Be careful of that line on that boat. You'll break it right there.
Oh, what a fish. Well, Rick, it really worked going back by there. She came out there and nailed it.
I know, you know, we cast in there about 3 or 4 times, so she didn't want it unless it was right there on top of her head.
Well, I have never caught a fish like that in my life.
I'm not sure I have, Gordon.
To fish effectively under a variety of conditions, you need a variety of equipment, tools to match the job at hand.
My favorite reel is the casting reel. I feel like it's the most versatile bass fishing reel of all. The modern casting reel is a whole lot easier to use with the magnetic spool controls. And they vary in gear ratios that you apply them to the type of lure that you're using. If you fish fast lure, you use a faster reel. A worm, you would not necessarily need as high gear ratio in your reel. This is the conventional rod here. It's a pistol grip handle, graphite, very light. You can fish it all day long very easily. This will be a worm rod. It's a little bit stiffer than your normal rod, so you can drive that hook in when you need it and get the fish out of that heavy brush. Very similar to that is the reel I'd like to use for my spinner baits, my crankbaits, topwater type lures. It's got a little bit faster tip, and it's also a faster ratio reel, so you can retrieve the lures a lot easier with less effort. There's also a new generation of rods and reels that's kind of come out in bass fishing in about the last 5 years, and one of those is what we refer to as our jig rod here. As you notice, it's got a little bit longer butt, and it's really, whenever I get a lot of thermal underwear on and my thermal gear on, and you all sitting here in the cold winter months and you have a tendency to be restricted as far as setting the hook, I like this longer butt because I can stick it here in my gut and I can feel the line better. Your sense of feel is worse in the winter months. Set the hook and control the fish a whole lot better with this style rod and reel. My favorite of all is probably the Neel and Reel rod. It really makes crankbait fishing a whole lot easier than it used to be. Not only can you cast it further with this type of action, but once you do cast it out there, you can actually put it right here along your rod, stick it beside your body, and it's a whole lot easier to crank that crankbait in all day long than it used to be. It's a very good rod for fishing crankbait type lures. The most efficient of all of them, I feel like, is the flip stick, because it's a very powerful rod, as you can see. But the reason it is because you've got to get in the heaviest cover in the lake to get the fish out with this. It's a worm technique. It's not a casting technique. We flip into that heavy cover, and when that bass hits, you want to blow him out of that big brush pile he's in and get him in the boat before he breaks your line. You use heavier line. It's got a very strong butt, and it's got a fairly strong tip. But it's designed for getting fish out of heavy, heavy cover. The last rod that I use is the spinning reel. And I really use it when I have to go to lighter line. 10-pound test, 6-pound test, 8-pound test line. I fish grub type baits with it. And the open face spinning reel is my favorite because it's just a whole lot easier to control. The finger touch on the line when you cast it. It handles twisting of your line a lot better than a closed face might handle it. But all these are specialized tools to do a specialized job, and that's the real key. You've got to match the right tool to the job, and that's why all these rods play a very important role in bass fishing. An excellent crankbait technique is what we would refer to as kneeling and reeling. The objective of this technique is to get your lure deeper than the other people's lures are fishing. Normally anywhere from 5 to maybe even 8 feet deeper. This gets you in a zone where the bass are not really used to a lot of baits being. It gives you a better chance of catching the fish, especially if they are deeper and slower to hit. Everybody fishes a worm a little bit different. My favorite way to fish it is to visualize what it's doing on the bottom. Too many people, when you throw a worm out there, they tend to work it too fast. It's one bait that you do have to slow down. I know we've been talking about a lot of speed in our fishing, but you do have to slow down when you fish the worm. The real key is that it is on the bottom. When you throw it out there, you let it sink, you keep your rod at about 10 o'clock. To keep a better feel, if you keep the rod way down here too low, then the fish hits it, he can handcuff you, and you really ain't got no room to drop and set the hook. So what you do is you let it fall to the bottom, and then mentally you got to concentrate on what the worm's doing. Hop it up off the bottom in short little hops. You want it to hop on the button in about 6-inch to 1-foot hops. Drag it across the cover. And the real key is that 9 out of 10 strikes occur when the worm's falling, not when you're moving it. When you're moving it, you'll hit stuff. That's usually you moving it into stuff. But when it's falling back, you kind of have to follow it back to the bottom, and you feel something just thump it like somebody thumped it.
I have a real problem setting the hook. Sometimes I can get it in them, sometimes I can't. But when I rear back on one, it just seems like I've just got a problem. What am I doing wrong?
You got to switch to a heavier rod. Most people fish a lighter rod when they fish other baits. Worm fishing, the hook is buried in the worm. That's called a Texas rig, and that's to make it weedless so you can work it through this heavy brush. But that requires that when a fish hits it, you have got to set the hook hard enough to drive that hook through the worm into the fish's mouth. Let me demonstrate for you how I set the hook. I'm not a real big guy, so to generate a lot of force, what I like to do is drop slack in my line. I drop from about 11 o'clock, drop slack to about 9 o'clock, and then just pop it out. Using your wrist and your elbows. You don't use your whole body. It's just more like a real quick snap. It's kind of like a dog. It's got slack in the end of his chain, and he takes off running. When he gets into that chain, you know what's going to happen to him. Just drop your line in. Just pop it out. Use your wrist, pull it to about right here, and then just crank about 2 times, and that's what pushes the hook on in. All the snap does is start to point in, and you got to drive it on in. That's between you and the fish to get it the rest of the way in.
How are we going to fish around this dock?
As you approach it, you always try to work the outer edges of it. Normally the corners, normally where it might make an indention in the dock, where a dock makes a T. The key on the corners, these little indentions in the dock at first, and then once you get closer to the dock, then you want to fish under the dock. Many times when the sun gets high, the fish back up under it and get in the shade. They're not going to run out and grab something. So that's when you either skip a bait up under it or flip up under the dock, a worm-type bait.
Well, are you going to try and get in the middle of the dock or just concentrate around the pilings?
This particular dock is a piling dock, and it does have pilings going down to the bottom, and that's probably what the fish are going to relate to, are those pilings. So that would be the key place to try to put your lure, would be near that piling. The real advantage of flipping is it allows you to get and put your lure in places people wouldn't even think about putting it. And then, even more important, the equipment that you use allows you to get the fish out, at least have a good chance of getting the fish out. How did he do that? This is what you're seeing right here is a drawback that once you feel one in this stuff, you cannot hesitate, because any movement he makes, he's just getting deeper in the stuff. Poor little fella. You got to hit them like they're 10 pounds, even though sometimes they're only 1 pound. Because if you don't, and he is 10 pounds, you'll never get him out. You got to get his head to the top and keep it on top in that thick brush. Because even if he gets hung up, at least I could probably plow the boat back in there to him and have a chance of getting him. If he gets hung up down there deep, you never will get him.
You know, we've been casting these baits back and forth, using basically the same bait. You got 2 strikes, you got 2 fish, I got no strikes and no fish. Are you doing something a little special with this spinner bait, or is it just a straight retrieve and you're casting better than I am?
I think it's real critical, especially on a spinnerbait like this. There's 2 things. There's one thing I'm doing that I've noticed you're not doing. I'm trying to run my bait into, around, and over everything I can possibly run it into. You tend to be trying to avoid everything. In other words, if I got a limb there, I want to hit that limb, where you're trying to get away from the limb or go by the limb, so you're not going to get hung. And the more things that bait comes in contact with, the more likely you are to generate a strike out of this bass. A lot of people ask about speed in working their lures. Really, the only thing I can tell them initially about speed is that you relate to the metabolism of the bass. In the cold weather months, this metabolism slows down, so you have to slow your lures down. As the temperatures warm up in the summer, his metabolism speeds up, so you tend to speed your lures up. But in reality, the final say is up to the bass. So you kind of have to keep a very open mind about working your lures. You know, work them at different speeds. This is a testing process we're going through when we're trying to find the fish and figure out how they want to take our baits. You work yours maybe fast, I'll work mine slow. We'll work them stop and go until we catch that first fish. And the real important thing there is to be conscious of every cast you make and the speed you're working it. Too many times you start daydreaming, looking at some pretty girl's skin, and you don't even know how fast you were reeling the lure when the fish hit. So you lost all that initial information. So be very conscious of the speed and the way you're working the bait, and when that first fish hits, and he'll tell us how he wants it.
What are your summer fishing techniques?
First, let me try to get you to make the transition from spring to summer, because I think that's the biggest drawback that most fishermen have, is that they have the success of the easy spring fishing, and they're very reluctant to make that transition from the spring into the summer. And the bass make it so much faster than we do as fishermen. So once the fish have quit spawning, then you've got to realize that they're making a very quick move from the shallows into the deeper water. And that's really the biggest difference in the summer, is now they've got many more alternatives where they can be. Not only can they be shallow like early in the morning, but they can be deep in the middle of the day, in the hot part of the day. They can use so much more of the lake than they were using in the spring. And this is the problem you have, is now instead of just a little bit of shoreline cover that you had in the spring to search out, now you've got much more water that you've got to search out to locate the fish. You've got to expand your techniques from shallow as well as shallow techniques. You've got to utilize your deep techniques to locate these fish.
Rick, what's the most important factor in developing a springtime pattern?
Gordon, is probably in water temperature, and more specifically the surface temperature, because by that time of the year, usually we're talking about anywhere from January to March, even April in many parts of the country, May in some parts of the country. The water is pretty much the same from top to bottom, so what changes is the surface. The surface is changing quicker than anything else that time of year. And so all you really have to relate to is the areas of the lake that tend to be warming the quickest. These are the fish that are going to become more aggressive and go into that spawning ritual a lot sooner than the other fish. The water temperature not only controls when they do this, but it also controls which section of the lake the bass spawn in first. They don't all spawn at the same time. They may spawn in the protected areas first, and then the last places where they're going to spawn will be the open, more exposed areas. So if I had to pick one variable, by far, it would be paying attention to that surface temperature.
What about light intensity? Does that have anything to do with our early morning, midday, or late afternoon techniques?
The most important thing is to remember is that the bass really doesn't have any eyelids. He can't physically shut out the light himself, so that in order to get away from the light penetration, then he's either got to get under something or something's got to diffract the light for him, for example, like wind, like cloudy water, murky water. So really what you're relating to when you're talking about light intensity, you're relating to how it positions fish. It controls the position of the fish. And that can be on the deep structure in the summer, like on a major drop-off. If it's in shallow water and he's got a lot of heavy vegetation, he'll get in the dark area up underneath it. Basically, light penetration positions your fish. The old-timers used to say, man, you can only catch bass early in the morning, late in the afternoon. Well, where they fished, which was along the shoreline, that was very true, because the light penetration there was only low early in the morning and late in the afternoon. Once the sun got up, it drove them out of that water. Now they could wade up and down that bank all they wanted and weren't going to catch any fish, because the fish moved out and probably moved out on a drop-off, settled to a depth that was very comfortable for them. But I think too many people put too much emphasis on color too many times when it really doesn't play that big a role. There's two real advantages of color. One is what I call the real advantage, and the other one is the psychological advantage. The real advantage is when the color really does make a difference to the fish. And what I try to do then, and just as a rule of thumb, is to try to match the natural habitat or the natural food, shad colors, perch colors, brim colors, crawfish colors, this type of relationship. The other advantage of color is psychological, and it's probably even as important as the real advantage, and that is what the fisherman thinks of the color. If he's confident in the color he's fishing, he throws it better, he works it with better intensity and better concentration, and consequently he catches more fish. Color occupies, in most fishermen's mind, about 50% of their thought process in a given day's fishing, and really it should only occupy about 2%. There's many, many things much more important in locating and catching fish than color.
What are the reasons fish strike?
Well, hunger is the obvious reason, but let's face it, they only feed a small portion of every day, so if you're going to catch bass all day long, you've got to appeal to other instincts. What? I knew I didn't have him that good. Sometimes you can appeal to their instinct of defending, like when they're spawning, defending the nest, or maybe the territory, the stump they're around, especially big bass do that when little fish come into the area. Also anger. I think you can literally throw into a spot so many times the fish just gets frustrated with that, whatever it is, intruding into their house. Sometimes, even though they're not hungry, they're greedy. They just want to run out and get that minnow before another one of the predators do.
What is the secret to catching big bass?
think a little bit slower. You got to use a little bit larger baits. Their metabolism requires just one big bite. They don't want to sit there and chase a bunch of little bitty minnows around all day like a small bass would to fill up their stomach. So they're looking for that one big brim or big crappie or big snake, and then when they eat it, they're going to get down under that log. Their metabolism's going to slow down, and they're just not going to hit. That's why so few of them are caught. So to catch them, you really have to be much more deliberate. You got to use larger bait. You got to work it much, much slower. And you got to really be satisfied with just 1, 2, 3 strikes all day instead of going out there trying to get 20, 30 strikes.
Whoa, there he is.
What were you doing when you hit, Gordon?
Rick, I let the bait kind of drop by that bush there, and he just came out of it and nailed it. I mean, he was aggressively
maybe that's what
after
we've been doing wrong. You know, we've been reeling it by it on a steady retrieve the whole time. That maybe what we need to do is just every time we get by a target, let it kind of flutter right there by the target, give the fish more of an opportunity.
Well, that did it only by accident. I guess we talked about that on the way out this morning, is that a lot of people catch fish by accident.
You know, Gordon, I think the most important thing to consistently catch bass is your ability to locate fish. Too many people get ahead of the game. They think, well, I'm going out and catch the fish. Well, you can't catch them until you locate them. And I think in the limited amount of time the fishermen have to fish, the only way you can successfully locate fish is to have an approach. My approach is kind of developed from, based on that limited amount of time, a way of looking at the water, maybe a little bit different than a lot of people look at the water. Too many people, when they drive up on especially a big body of water, they get there, the first thing they see is the water. And they look at it and it's pretty and it's green and it's blue and it's clear, and they think the fish can be everywhere, but that's not the case. And actually, that's their environment, but what positions the fish in the water is the objects. And really what I try to do when I go to the lake is actually to visualize if you pulled the plug on the lake and you drained it, and now I look and there are all these objects standing out. And the thing that would surprise you, whether you're fishing a big lake or a small lake, is that there's really, within a given area, just very few types that can hold fish. And I kind of go by the rule of thumb that normally if I go into a given area, there's probably less than 6 places you'd ever catch fish if you identified all these objects that hold the bass. So the main thing is to look at water different. And when I go into the area, is to identify the visible objects, the ones that we all see sticking up, the ones you like to cast that pretty top water by. And then once I identify all the visible ones, then I think, well, there's probably some under the water. And this is where you come with your maps, and then you also use your depth finder and you locate those, what we call more subtle objects. But the real key I'm trying to get across to people is that don't make fishing more complicated than it really is. The bass is object-oriented. Once you identify the objects where he's at, it's just a matter of systematically eliminating them until you find which one he's using, and then stick with it that day until the conditions change and he changes. Gordon, I know we're both a little bit anxious to get started here, but you know, whether we're fishing a 100,000-acre man-made impoundment or just a small farm pond, when I stop and get in the area I want to fish, the first thing I like to do is try to identify all the visible alternatives where the bass could be. You know, for example, you might have the brush here on the right. You might have all these little bitty points with the grass coming off into the water. We have some hyacinths floating over here. And then what I do is just try to, once I identify all those objects the fish could be on, then I try to systematically eliminate them. And I usually try to fish one type instead of skipping back and forth to, well, grass, brush, points. I try to eliminate one type at a time until I figure out where the fish are at. And then I stick with that particular pattern and just progress on it. Gordon, here's a good example of bass habitat right here in front of us. One thing you got to remember about a bass, he's a predator, and he's a fairly aggressive predator, but his favorite tactic is ambush. And he uses a bush or a brush pile like this for several reasons. He likes it because it's a dark place that he can get under to get away from the sunlight, but even more so, it's a terrific ambush area that he can lay in there, shoot out, grab a brim or a shad or whatever that might come by, and get back into this brush, which is kind of a secure place like our home might be to us. In a sense, that is his home. That's what he relates to most of his life in a given area. So let's start, by eliminating these trees and these old brush that's out in the water here. So why don't you, make a few casts around there with your lure, and I'll try something else. Always try to cast past the target all the way to the bank and come on through the whole target. In other words, try not to hit your bait in the strike zone. See, like that, that was a good shot.
Let me try it again here. Okay.
That was a good shot. Of course, he had to jump a little high to get that one. Dang, there's a strike right there. I'm more apt to sometimes using that on this type of fish. Do the light line. Depends on where he's hooked. If he's got the bait way down in his mouth, that line may be across his teeth and he can break it very easily. But if he's hooked out on the outside like this and he's got that hook protecting the line, then you're in pretty good shape.
Certain methods and rigs become popular because they're successful. Among pros and other serious bass fishermen, the plastic worm ranks at the top of fish catching lures.
The most popular rig is what we call the Texas rig. You use a slip sinker that actually slides up and down the line, and then you tie on your hook with any conventional knot that you prefer. And the real key is, of course, it's the worm itself and how you hook the worm on. The most important thing, I think, in hooking the worm on is that you actually keep the worm straight. This particular hook allows you to do that real well. The worm is straight. What this does is keep your line from twisting. Twisting weakens your line, plus it makes it harder to cast. So now what you see is we've got the slip sinker ahead of the worm, the straight worm, and as you see, it's buried. The hook is buried inside the worm to make it weedless. What I like to do is kind of push, like you see my finger on the other side, until I feel a point. This kind of makes it a little channel for the hook to go through, so you don't have to hit the fish quite as hard when he bites the worm. Let me illustrate again how you hook this worm on. You take and run the top or the little part of this hook right dead in the head of the center of the worm. It's got a little barb on it, so it'll hold it like that right there. And then go ahead and use the meat part of the hook and hook it into around the egg sac on the worm. Again, yes, you see, that gives us a real straight worm, and that's really kind of the most important thing with worm, is to try to keep it straight so it doesn't twist your line. Often, you don't want the sinker to slide up and down your line, so what we'll do is we'll take a toothpick and peg it like when you're going to be fishing in real thick vegetation. Okay, what we do is, like you have the sinker here, we go in the rear end of the sinker, take the sharp end of the toothpick. Be careful not to pinch your line so it doesn't break it. And just kind of wedge it up in there so the sinker won't slide up and down the line. Break it off, kind of make sure it's up in there firmly. And then you slide it right back down against the head of the worm so it stays butted up against the head of the worm. That way it doesn't slide up and down the line. The reason you do that is because if you're flipping in heavy vegetation and the sinker gets out here, the worm might go down on one piece of the weed and the sinker on the other, and it won't go to the bottom. So by keeping the sinker against the head of the worm, that won't happen.
Successful fishermen learn quickly to identify changing situations and then make rapid changes in their techniques from one type of cover to another.
Notice how high these banks are here. We've got a fairly vertical bank, which means we've probably got a fairly vertical drop coming off here. Many times, the way I like to fish this type of bank, especially when it's got very small amount of cover on the bank like we do here, is to use a crankbait. But I like to do what I call parallel the crankbait, because if you move the boat out away from the bluff and throw straight into it at a 90-degree angle, your cast is only effective for about the first 10 yards off the bank, and then you get out where it's really not effective any longer. You get out in the deeper water away from the whatever available cover is. So what I'll do is I'll try to parallel it with the crankbait. So I'm working straight down the bank and keeping my bait. As you can see, my bait, the whole length of the cast will stay near where the potential bass may be lying. It's just a much more efficient way to work this type of water.
The average guy usually casts randomly around the shoreline hoping for a strike. But the real difference here is knowing how to read the cover, how to visualize what cover is below the surface that is attracting bass, and then how to fish it successfully.
You know, at first glance, this just looks like a bunch of brush, but what you really got to do is get a whole lot closer and look at it. Actually, what we have here is two different types. We've got one tree that's actually fallen in and submerged. We got another one that's just an overhang type tree. You've got to fish both of them a little bit different. The overhang tree, the fish are going to relate to the branches that are sticking down in the water more often than not. So you don't necessarily catch them on the bottom. You let it through the bush, pick it up near the top, and just kind of jiggle it. In the fall, the tree fall that's actually in the water that extends to the bottom, then you're more apt to be working through the limbs on the bottom. That's where you'd be catching the fish. Kind of learn to recognize there are two different types of trees here that we're fishing.
A popular and effective way to fish this type of cover is with the flipping technique.
Some people get the impression that you're trying to shoot rabbits with an elephant gun when they look at your equipment you use in flipping, but really it all serves a very important purpose. You got usually a 7.5 to 8 foot rod. It's got a kind of a quick little tip so you can actually flip it out there effortlessly, plus a nice little feel to the bait when it's in the water. It's got to have a strong butt to handle this 30-pound, 25-pound test line when you set the hook and hit the fish. Plus, it's got to have a strong butt to be able to pull the fish out of this thick type of cover. The reel is important too. Nowadays, most of our reels that we buy are high-speed reels, and in flipping, you really don't want your higher-speed reels. You want to drop down a few notches. The reason is you're so close to the fish, and when you hit a good fish, 5-6 pound fish and this stuff, the real high-speed reel, he'll actually lock it up where you can't really move the fish. So you need to go to a little bit lower speed retrieve ratio on your reel. Also, the line is very critical. It has to withstand a lot of shock and a lot of abrasion, and I recommend that you don't use anything under 25-pound test. I don't. I know in extreme clear water cases sometimes you do. The flipping is not a clear water technique. It's a heavy cover or murky water technique. So usually your line is camouflaged by all the cover or by the color of the water itself. So those heavier diameter lines I think are very important to getting, especially when you get into good fish. And this is a good fish, quality fish technique. Got to keep that in mind. So I normally use 25 and sometimes even larger. One of the biggest mistakes people make flipping is actually the boat itself. Boat control is very crucial in flipping because your concentration has to be split between the boat, the rod, the mechanics of flipping, and also trying to determine exactly where the fish is in the cover. So your mind's having to do many things there at once. But if your boat gets in too close, it potentially spooks the fish, or you're cramped and you can't make a correct flip. If you're too far away, then you can't get into the middle of the cover. Your bait presentation's all wrong. So boat control is probably the hardest thing for people to initially develop. A real advantage of flipping is it allows you to get and put your lure in places people wouldn't even think about putting it. And then even more important, the equipment that you use allows you to get the fish out, at least have a good chance of getting the fish out. How did he do that? This is what you're seeing right here is a drawback that once you feel one in this stuff, you cannot hesitate. Because any movement he makes, he's just getting deeper in the stuff.
Oh, there he is.
Oh, what a... Come out of there, buddy.
Whoa.
Don't give him back.
About gave him a free one, didn't I?
The flipping technique is very productive when done as demonstrated. However, many of us would rather fish topwater spinners because they appear to be easier to use. But there are some fine points to be mastered with spinners, too.
Spinner bait is, number one, I rarely throw one overhand like you did then, like this, mainly because of all the overhang obstructions. And I like to fish spinner bait in real thick brush. And number two, shorten your cast up a little bit. Spinner bait, most of your fish are going to be real close to the boat. You kind of loop cast it in right into the pass of brush and come through it and walk it over the limbs. Try to hit everything in that structure you can. There you go. Woo.
Some kind of good fish.
As we progress into the fall and the winter, the cooler months of the year, you got to start thinking vertical. To locate them, they tend to be relating to more of a vertical drop, a more vertical weed line where you have deeper water. They wouldn't be on that sloping bank. They'd be on this deeper, more vertical bank over here. If you're fishing underwater structure, you got to fish the deep drops on the creek channels, the more vertical drops. A bass does not want to move horizontally a long ways in the winter. He doesn't mind moving vertically to adjust with his changing cold fronts. And so that's why I really start to look for these real shear type drops in the fall and the winter months. The fish, the good thing about the fall is the fish tend to concentrate. But in doing that, it makes them harder to find. It's a feast or famine situation. You look and you look and you look and you don't find anything. All of a sudden, boom, there they are, and you catch 25 to 30 out of one little spot. Probably the most common bait we use in the colder months, the winter months, is what we refer to as the jig and pig. And the reason it gets that name is that you have the jig on one hand and then a piece of pork rind on the other hand. And this pork comes in all different colors and shapes and sizes. And what we do is we actually take and hook this pork on the end of the jig. And then what you have is a jig with a trailer on the end of it. It's a slow bait. You work it on the bottom, and it's a very good bait in the colder winter months. Fishing a jig is very similar to fishing a worm. I use a little bit different rod because I fish it at a different time of year. I fish it in my cold weather months. I use a little bit longer handle rods. This allows me, with all my thermal gear on, to have better control of the lure and better control of the fish whenever he gets on the lure. But the only difference between the jig and the worm is you fish it probably a little slower. You try to relate to it being a crawfish or a salamander in the cold winter months when the metabolism is slowed down, crawling across the bottom. And the other big difference between a jig and a worm is a lot of times they will not hold the jig due to the lead head like they would a worm, so you got to be a lot quicker when the fish does strike.
Knowing how to use various lures is just as important as where.
The strike zone sometimes around a bush like that can be very large or it can be very small due to the bass, how aggressive the bass is at that particular time. You got to always make the assumption it's very small and work from there. If it's very large, that's just a bonus. In other words, if you miss it 4 foot and he runs out there and grabs it, that's just a bonus. But you can't. But it's best to try to make the assumption that it's a small strike zone. So what I want to do on this type of bank is use lures that stay up there close to it as long as possible. A lure you throw up there and gets out and comes out away from the bank fast, you're not staying in the strike zone very long. For example, if this was a fast-moving bait, I throw it up there. About that point, it starts to become very unproductive. From the rest of the cast to the boat is wasted cast. So what I want to do is I want to use like this topwater, which I've got all fouled up at the moment. Throw it up there near the bank and leave it. Give the bass an opportunity to come out and take it. Allow it to stay near that strike zone area, near the bank, near the cover as long as possible. Once I do finally get it out here away from the strike zone, now don't mess around. Get it on in and get back. A worm be the same type of thing. We can throw it up there and keep it near the drop, work it down the ledge until we feel like we've worked it away from the bank and away from the cover, and now go ahead and reel it back in. Don't work it all the way out here underneath the boat unless there was some kind of structure like a tree fall coming all the way out. Don't work it all the way, reel it back in and fire it right back up there. We're trying to fish the high potential area here.
How long do we leave like a floating type minnow bait we got on here now? How long do we let it sit there after it hits the water?
Well, you try to let the fish tell you. You try different things. Initially, what I like to do, I like to start by throwing it up there and just letting it sit. Maybe sometimes that's what they want. They want it just sitting there dead still. And then I try to think in terms of something that's wounded. You know, just trying to get away, then it kind of stops and sits there for a little bit, moves a little bit more, works. Okay, really, the real key, though, you've got to keep experimenting. That first fish will tell you how he wants it. Sometimes you got to work it a little different. Sometimes you may throw it up there, come out fast, and right before you get to the edge of the strike zone, stop it. Just like if fish doesn't get it now, it's going to get away from it. But again, you keep experimenting with different type of presentations until you get that first strike. And that first fish, really pay a lot of attention to how he took it, why he took it. When we're looking for fish especially, I'll get you like to throw that quieter topwater you're fishing, and I'll throw this noisier one, and we'll see which one they want. And if you start catching fish, then I'll switch to the type of bait you're using. But there's no sense, if we haven't caught the fish yet or figured out what they want, to use the same bait. So let's use a little bit different type working baits until we figure out what they want to do. Again. boy, just barely.
All right.
And it just twisted a couple times. Got those blades barely turned.
All right. Look at there.
I just started to move it when he barely had that spinner spinning when he hit it.
Need the net?
No, getting in the head or anything on it.
All
Tell you,
right.
with this type of bait, though, you got to be a little bit more careful than you would with another one because he makes the wrong move at the wrong time. He might just show you how that hook feels. Let me get his mouth around it. When you finally decide to go for him, though, then that's when you want to get him. Okay.
There you
Bait
go.
on the wrong side.
Well, that sure is a good-looking fish there, Rick. I say he hit right after the blade started turning?
Yeah, I just pitched it up there, let it sit, and just turned the back blade, just started rotating. That's when he come out of there and got it.
Sometimes it doesn't take much to get him to hit.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes forever. You know how that goes.
That's right. Pull him out of there. Pull him out.
That's a net.
What a fighter. Do it, Rick. What you threw right in there in that clear spot behind you.
Watch, Glenn, I'm going to kind of show you a couple little things on this particular fish. Gordon, when you're going to land one of these on a single hook bait like this, he's hooked very well. It's down deep in his mouth, and then you see that mouth is open. When you go for him, make sure you can grab him quick. Don't be tentative about it, and just hold it, get a good firm grip on him. That'll kind of semi-paralyze him. If you're using a treble hook bait like a crankbait or a minnow type bait, I often recommend that you go ahead and use a net, because those things got way too many hooks. If you make a mistake, you're going to end up with one of the hooks in you. I'm trying to run my bait into, around, and over everything I can possibly run it into. You tend to be trying to avoid everything. In other words, if I got a limb there, I want to hit that limb, where you're trying to get away from the limb or go by the limb, and so you're not going to get hung. And the more things that bait comes in contact with, the more likely you are to generate a strike out of those bass. There is no tricks or magic to bass fishing. It really boils down to concentration and a lot of hard work and being very aware of what the fish are doing when they take your bait and then trying to duplicate that. If I throw up here in this brush, I come by that limb and I bump that limb and come over it. And when I drop it, the fish hits it, then I'm going to try to duplicate that to catch the fish. Contrary to popular myth, the really good fishermen I know are not patient fishermen. You cannot sit there and wait for the bass to come to you. You got to move, you got to keep thinking, you got to keep trying different areas in order in that limited amount of time you've got to fish to eliminate all that non-productive water and find out where that little bit of productive water is where you can catch the bass. It's real important in fishing lures to be able to change your pace. Spinnerbait, I like to fish it fairly fast in sight most of the time, varying the speed, fast, stop and go, dropping it by, obstruction every once in a while. And then all of a sudden now you decide I'm going to fish a worm. Now you got to have the ability to change your pace and really slow down, let that worm go down, fish the bottom. Too many people can't change the pace quick enough. They try to fish a worm fast like they're fishing a spinnerbait, or try to fish a spinnerbait slow, and that really doesn't work very well. So learn to be able to change your pace. Weather changes in frontal passages control the aggressiveness of the fish. As you well know, right before the front comes through, the fish tend to be very aggressive. They tend to go into almost a frenzy sometimes feeding. And then once the front actually passes, then they go in the opposite direction. They become less aggressive. And so basically what that tells you to do is that it actually controls your attitude about the next day's fishing. You can't go out there thinking I'm going to catch a bunch of fish. You've got to go out there and say, hey, it's going to be tough. I got to slow down. I got to be more deliberate. Your presentation has to be more exact. If the day before he's sitting in this bush and he'd charge out of this bush and grab your lure, well, tomorrow when the front's passed, he's not going to do that. He's going to stay at the base of the bush. Well, after fun, I go out there with a 5-strike attitude. And that way, when I go out there and I fish for 2 or 3 hours and I don't get a strike, I'm not disappointed because I know I'm not going to get many that day anyway. If you go out there with a 30-strike attitude, you're destroyed in the first 2 hours. You're mentally, psychologically defeated. That is just a tough fishing condition, probably the toughest.
Whoa, there he is. Whoop, here it comes. Go! Come on up here, Bubba. Whoa! Beautiful, beautiful. Yes, sir. Come on, Rod.
Oh, that's what we came for, Captain. Yes, sir. That's 10 pounds. Thank you, baby. What I caught. Look at him.
Fishing is for fun. Even a professional like Ricky Clunn still gets excited about catching a bass. That's the way it should be. It's a recreational contest between you and the fish, and between you and your friend who have shared some valuable leisure time together.
Hey, Rick, could you back the boat up? I'm hung up.